The first thing anyone noticed about Captain Elias Cater wasn't his reputation or his decorations. It was the silence that followed him. Not the awkward kind, but the heavy, inevitable kind that settled over a room when someone walked in carrying ghosts no one else could see. He'd been flying A-10 Thunderbolts for 11 years, most of that time in places the news stopped covering after the first month. His call sign was Bastion, earned not for bravado, but for the way he'd held position over a surrounded convoy in Helmand Province for 4 hours straight, taking ground fire the entire time, never breaking station, never flinching. The aircraft he flew that day came back with over 200 holes in it. Cater came back without saying much at all. Now he was stationed at Bagram Airfield, assigned to the 75th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron, and the younger pilots watched him the way you watch a structure you're not sure will hold. There was something unreadable in his eyes, something that made you think twice before asking him to join for drinks or tell a war story. He didn't avoid people exactly. He just existed slightly apart from them, like a shadow that had learned to walk on its own. On the morning everything changed. The briefing room was packed and tense. Intelligence had confirmed that a NATO medical convoy was pinned down in the Tangi Valley, 12 clicks west of the nearest forward operating base. Taliban forces had the convoy boxed in with small arms, RPGs, and at least 2 heavy machine gun emplacements in elevated positions. The convoy had been trying to evacuate wounded Afghan civilians from a village that had been hit during a firefight the day before. Now they were stuck, taking fire from 3 sides, and the weather was closing in fast. The mission was designated Close Air Support, Immediate Response, Danger Close. That meant flying low, firing near friendlies, and accepting that the margin for error was non-existent. 2 F-16s had already been scrambled, but they were 30 minutes out, and the convoy didn't have 30 minutes. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Voss, scanned the room with the expression of a man choosing who to send into a burning building. His eyes landed on Cater, then moved to the pilot standing near the back wall, almost out of sight. Her name was Captain Rhea Marin, call sign Revenant, and she was the kind of person people underestimated exactly once. Marin had flown A-10s in Iraq and Syria, racked up over 800 combat hours, and never lost a single soldier she was tasked to protect. But she was quiet, methodical, and didn't perform for the crowd, so the louder voices in the squadron often drowned her out. Cater knew better. He'd flown with her twice before, both times in situations where most pilots would have pulled off target. She hadn't. She'd stayed, adjusted, and delivered. Voss pointed at them both. Bastion, Revenant. You're up, wheels up in 10. Convoy call sign is Shepherd 2-1. They're taking effective fire and running low on ammo. Get in there and buy them time. The room emptied in seconds, pilots scattering toward the flight line. Cater grabbed his helmet and glanced at Marin. She met his eyes, gave a single nod, and followed him out into the dust and heat. Neither of them said a word, but they didn't need to. They both knew what close air support in the Tangi Valley meant. It meant flying into a canyon with walls on both sides, limited maneuver space, and enemies who'd learned to wait until you committed before opening fire. It meant your aircraft would take hits, and you'd have to decide in real time whether to break off or push through. The A-10s sat on the flight line like crouched predators, gray and angular, their noses painted with shark teeth that were more warning than decoration. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon protruded from beneath the fuselage like a spine made of tungsten, capable of firing 30mm rounds at a rate that could shred armored vehicles in seconds. Cater's aircraft, tail number 279, had seen more combat than most pilots ever would. The armored titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit was scarred and discolored from previous engagements, and the engines mounted high on the fuselage had been replaced twice. Marin's bird, tail number 312, was slightly newer but just as worn. She walked around it slowly, checking control surfaces, inspecting the pylons loaded with Maverick missiles and Hydra rocket pods. Her pre-flight routine was ritualistic, almost meditative. Cater watched her for a moment, then climbed into his own cockpit. The seat was firm, the harness tight across his chest, the control stick worn smooth from years of use. He powered up the systems, listening to the turbines spool up with a low, building whine that climbed into a roar. The HUD flickered to life, displaying altitude, airspeed, weapon status. Everything was green. He checked in over the radio. Bastion is up. A moment later, Marin's voice came through, calm and clear. Revenant is up. Tower cleared them for departure, and Cater advanced the throttles, feeling the aircraft lurch forward. The A-10 wasn't fast or elegant. It was blunt force with wings, built to absorb punishment and keep flying. He loved it for that. They lifted off in formation, climbing into a sky that was beginning to cloud over from the west. The forecast had called for deteriorating visibility by midday, which meant they'd be working in limited visual conditions, possibly with cloud cover obscuring the valley floor. Not ideal for close air support, but nothing about this mission was ideal. Cater banked east, following the terrain toward the mountains. Below them, the brown and tan landscape stretched out in endless ridges and dry riverbeds, dotted with clusters of mud brick compounds that could hide anything. Marin stayed on his right wing, her aircraft steady and precise. They didn't talk much on the way in. There was no point. They both knew the briefing, knew the terrain, knew what they'd face. The convoy's frequency crackled to life as they closed on the valley. Any station, this is Shepherd 2-1. We are under effective fire from Grid November Delta 476283, taking casualties, request immediate air support, how copy? The voice was tight, stressed, but disciplined. Whoever was calling had been in this situation before. Cater keyed his mic. Shepherd 2-1, Bastion. Flight of 2 A-10s inbound your position, 5 minutes out. Say nature of fire and friendly positions. Bastion, Shepherd, we've got small arms and RPGs from the ridgeline north and east, heavy machine guns on elevated positions. Friendlies are in the riverbed, marked with IR strobes. We've got wounded and limited cover. Break. We need you to suppress those gun positions or we're not making it out. Cater exchanged a glance with Marin through the canopy, though they were too far apart to see each other's expressions. They both understood. The convoy was pinned in a natural kill zone and the enemy had the high ground. Standard procedure would be to come in from altitude, identify targets with the lightning targeting pod, and engage from range. But with cloud cover moving in and friendlies that close to the enemy positions, they'd need to go low, visual, and precise. Dangerous, but necessary. Shepherd, Bastion copies all. We're coming in low and fast. Keep your heads down and mark targets if able. Revenant, you copy. Revenant copies. I'll take the eastern ridge, you take north. Solid copy. Let's go to work. They descended into the valley in a shallow dive, dropping through the cloud layer that was beginning to form. The world narrowed to steep canyon walls and a dry riverbed snaking between them. Cater could see the convoy now, 4 vehicles clustered together, figures moving between them in controlled bursts. Smoke rose from one of the trucks. The ridgelines on either side were jagged and uneven, dotted with boulders and scraggly vegetation that provided perfect cover for enemy fighters. Muzzle flashes flickered from multiple positions, and Cater could see tracer rounds arcing down toward the convoy. He armed his cannon and adjusted his approach angle, lining up on the northern ridge. His targeting reticle settled over a cluster of rocks where he'd seen sustained fire. He squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared to life with a sound that was less like gunfire and more like the earth tearing open. The recoil shook the entire airframe, and a stream of 30mm rounds chewed through the ridgeline, sending up geysers of dust and shattered stone. Cater walked the fire across the target area, methodical and relentless. Explosions blossomed where the rounds impacted, and the muzzle flashes ceased. He pulled up hard, banking left to avoid ground fire, feeling the airframe shudder as something clipped his right stabilizer. The damage indicator stayed green, not critical. Marin was already inbound on the eastern ridge, her approach steeper and faster. She fired a pair of Hydra rockets, white contrails streaking down toward the machine gun nest. The explosions were sharp and precise, collapsing part of the ridgeline and silencing the heavy gun. She pulled off target, rolling inverted for a moment before leveling out. Revenant's off target, eastern gun position destroyed. Bastion copies. Shepard say status. There was a pause, then the convoy commander's voice came back, breathless but relieved. Bastion, Shepard, that bought us some breathing room. We've got one vehicle mobility killed, transferring wounded now. Stand by for secondary targets. Cater climbed back to altitude, scanning the ridgelines. The valley was filling with smoke and dust, making it harder to see, but he trusted his instruments and his instincts. Movement caught his eye near a cluster of trees on the northern slope. He zoomed in with the targeting pod and saw figures repositioning, dragging what looked like a recoilless rifle. Shepard Bastion, I've got enemy forces repositioning on the north slope, grid November Delta 476315. Confirm you want me to engage. Bastion, Shepard confirms that's enemy, clear to engage. Cater rolled in again, lower this time, feeling the terrain compress around him. The canyon walls blurred past on either side, close enough that he could see individual rocks and fissures. The A-10 was built for this, armored and steady, but it still required absolute precision. One wrong move and he'd be flying into a cliff face or giving the enemy a perfect shot. He centered the reticle on the target and fired again. The cannon spooled up, shaking the aircraft as it unleashed another torrent of rounds. The enemy position disintegrated under the barrage, bodies and equipment scattered like debris in a storm. Cater pulled off hard, feeling G-forces press him into his seat. His breathing was controlled, his heart rate elevated but steady. This was what he'd trained for, what he'd done 100 times before, but it never got easier and it never stopped mattering. Marin called in. Revenant's got visual on reinforcements moving in from the east, 6 to 8 individuals armed. Looks like they're trying to flank the convoy. Copy, Revenant, take them. She didn't respond verbally, just adjusted her flight path and dove back in, her aircraft a gray streak against the brown valley floor. She fired her cannon in short, controlled bursts, each one precise and devastating. The enemy fighters scattered, trying to find cover, but there was nowhere to go. Marin tracked them with mechanical efficiency, her rounds finding targets with surgical accuracy. When she pulled off, the threat was neutralized. The fight continued for another 20 minutes, a brutal back and forth as enemy forces kept trying to reposition, and the two A-10s kept tearing them apart. Cater lost count of how many gun runs he made, how many times he heard the low fuel warning chime in his helmet. His aircraft had taken more hits, small arms fire punching through non-critical areas, but the titanium bathtub held. It always did. Finally, the convoy commander's voice came through, shaky but alive. Bastion, Shepard, we've got all wounded loaded and we're mobile. You two just saved our lives. We're moving to extraction point now. Copy, Shepard. We'll cover your movement. Stay tight. Cater and Marin circled overhead as the convoy limped out of the valley, their aircraft orbiting like watchful birds of prey. No more fire came from the ridges. The enemy had either retreated or been destroyed. It was over. As they climbed back to altitude and turned west toward Bagram, Cater let out a slow breath. His hands were steady on the stick, his body still humming with adrenaline. He glanced over at Marin's aircraft, her wings still tucked in close to his. She'd flown perfectly, as she always did. Fearless, precise, relentless. He keyed the mic. Good work, Revenant. There was a pause, then her voice came back, quieter than before. You too, Bastion, let's get home. They flew back in silence, the mountains falling away behind them, the sky above them vast and indifferent. The mission was a success. The convoy was safe, but Cater knew the cost. Every gun run, every destroyed position, every life ended in the valley below, it all added up. It all stayed with you. When they landed, the sun was higher, the heat oppressive. Cater taxied his aircraft back to the hardstand and shut down the engines. The silence that followed was profound. He sat in the cockpit for a long moment, staring at the instrument panel, his helmet resting on his lap. His hands were shaking slightly now, the adrenaline fatting, the reality setting in. He climbed out slowly, his legs stiff, and walked around the aircraft. The damage was worse than he'd thought. Dozens of bullet holes perforated the wings and fuselage, and part of the right stabilizer was torn away. The titanium bathtub had taken several direct hits, the metal cratered but unbroken. The crew chief, a sergeant named Ortiz, was already inspecting the damage, shaking his head in disbelief. "Sir, how the hell did you fly this thing back?" Cater didn't answer. He just stared at the holes, at the places where a few inches difference would have meant the bullets hit something critical. Would have meant he didn't come back. Marin walked over, her flight suit stained with sweat, her helmet tucked under her arm. She looked at his aircraft, then at him. "You good?" He nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. "Yeah, you?" "I'm fine." She paused, then added, "That was close." "It always is." They stood there for a moment, not saying anything, just existing in the shared understanding that only combat pilots have. The knowledge that they'd just done something most people would never comprehend, and that tomorrow they might have to do it again. Later that afternoon, after debriefing and paperwork, Cater found himself alone in the squadron-ready room. The space was quiet, most of the pilots off doing other things. He sat in one of the worn chairs, staring at the wall where mission plaques and unit insignia were mounted. His mind kept replaying the mission, the way the valley had looked from above, the sound of the cannon, the voice of the convoy commander calling for help. He thought about the lives they'd saved and the lives they'd ended. Both were necessary, both mattered. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Marin standing in the doorway. She held 2 bottles of water, one of which she tossed to him. He caught it, nodded his thanks. She sat down in the chair across from him, unscrewing the cap and taking a long drink. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Marin said, "You ever think about why we do this?" Cater looked at her, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, why we keep flying. Why we keep going back into situations like that." He thought about it, turning the question over in his mind. "Because someone has to." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." She smiled faintly, a sad kind of smile. "Yeah, me too." They sat in silence after that, and Cater felt something shift between them. Not friendship exactly, but recognition. They were both carrying the same weight, both walking the same path, and sometimes just knowing someone else understood was enough. The next morning, Cater was called into Lieutenant Colonel Voss's office. He expected a routine debrief or maybe praise for the mission. Instead, Voss looked grim. "Sit down, Captain." Cater sat, his instincts prickling. Something was wrong. Voss leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "How much do you know about the situation in the Korangal Valley?" "Enough," Cater said carefully. The Korangal was one of the most dangerous areas in Afghanistan, a narrow valley where insurgents had been fighting coalition forces for years. It was brutal terrain, even worse than Tangi. "We've got a situation developing. A platoon from the 101st is pinned down near a village called Yaka, China. They've been under siege for 2 days, and resupply hasn't been able to get through. Weather's been bad, visibility's near zero, and enemy forces are well dug in. We've lost 2 helicopters trying to insert reinforcements." Cater felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "And you want us to provide air support?" "Not just air support. We need someone to fly in under the weather, make contact with the platoon, and hold the line until we can extract them. It's going to be low-level, high-risk, and the margins are non-existent. I'm not going to order anyone to take this mission. I'm asking for volunteers." Cater didn't hesitate. "I'll do it." Voss nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. "I figured you would. Marin already volunteered too. You'll fly together, same as yesterday. Wheels up at 600 tomorrow." That night Cater couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the base around him. He thought about the Korangal, about the platoon that was waiting for help, about the fact that he and Marin would be flying into conditions that had already claimed 2 aircraft. He thought about the line between bravery and stupidity, and how thin it really was. At some point, he got up and walked outside. The night was cool, the sky filled with stars that seemed impossibly bright against the darkness. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the cold air, trying to quiet his mind. "Can't sleep either." He turned to see Marin approaching, her hands shoved in the pockets of her jacket. "No," he admitted, "me neither." She came to stand beside him, looking up at the same stars. "You scared?" "Always," he said, "but I'll fly anyway." "Yeah," she said softly, "me too." They stood there together in the darkness, 2 pilots facing the unknown, held together by duty and something deeper. something that didn't need words. The next morning they flew into the Quorangle. The weather was as bad as promised, clouds hanging low over the mountains, visibility reduced to a few hundred meters. The valley was narrow and winding, the terrain unforgiving. Cater flew on instruments, trusting his training and his aircraft. Marin stayed close, her presence a steady reassurance. When they made contact with the platoon, the situation was worse than anyone had described. The soldiers were dug into a defensive position on a ridgeline, surrounded on three sides by enemy forces. They were low on ammunition, low on water, and had multiple wounded. The platoon leader, a lieutenant named Garza, sounded exhausted over the radio. "Bastion, this is Guardian 3. We are danger close on all sides. We need fire support on the southern and eastern slopes, but you're going to be flying practically on top of us. How copy?" "Guardian 3, Bastion copies all. We'll make it work. Mark your position with IR strobes and stay down." Cater and Marin descended into the valley, the clouds pressing in around them, the mountains rising like walls on either side. The enemy positions were barely visible through the haze, but the muzzle flashes gave them away. Cater armed his weapons and rolled in, his heart pounding, his focus absolute. He fired, adjusted, fired again. The cannon roared, the aircraft shook, and the valley erupted in smoke and fire. Beside him, Marin was doing the same, her aircraft a blur of motion, her rounds hitting with surgical precision. They flew mission after mission, gun run after gun run, until their weapons were nearly exhausted and their fuel was running low. But they didn't leave. They couldn't. The platoon was depending on them. Finally, after what felt like hours, helicopters appeared through the clouds, moving in fast to extract the soldiers. Cater and Marin circled overhead, providing cover until the last soldier was aboard and the helicopters were clear. Only then did they turn for home. They landed at Bagram with almost no fuel left, their aircraft battered and smoking. Cater climbed out of the cockpit and nearly collapsed, his legs shaking, his body completely spent. Marin was beside him, leaning against her aircraft, her face pale and drawn. They looked at each other and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. They had done the impossible, flown into hell and brought people back, and they had done it together. A week later, Cater was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. So was Marin. The ceremony was brief, formal, and felt hollow. The medals were symbols, but they couldn't capture what had really happened in those valleys, in those moments when everything hung in the balance. Afterward, Cater found Marin outside the ceremony hall, standing alone. He walked over and they stood side by side, looking out at the mountains in the distance. "You ever think about what happens after all this?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to stop flying." "Yeah," she said quietly, "me neither." They stood there for a long time, two pilots bound by war and duty watching the sky, and in that moment Cater realized something. The silence he carried, the weight of all those missions and all those ghosts, it wasn't something he had to carry alone. Marin understood. She carried it too, and maybe that was enough. 3 months later the call came. Another mission, another valley, another group of soldiers who needed them. Cater and Marin suited up without hesitation, climbed into their A-10s and flew toward the sound of gunfire. It was what they did, it was who they were, and as long as there were people who needed saving, they would keep flying. No matter the cost, no matter the risk, because that was the promise they'd made, not to their commanders or their country but to themselves, to never leave anyone behind. To always answer the call. And as they disappeared into the distant mountains, the sky above them vast and unforgiving, that promise held strong, unbroken, eternal.